To my left, I have 3 Sony G Master lenses and the Sony flagship mirrorless camera, the A1. This is secretly an A7 III because I'm shooting with the A1, but for the sake of this, let's pretend that's the A1. And to my right, I have Sony's newest Xperia smartphone, the Xperia 1 Mark IV. Now on my left is about 12.5K worth of lenses and the camera body itself, and the Xperia phone itself, the budget to be determined, probably going to be around $1,000 or a little more expensive than $1,000, $1,500, I'd say. Now what we want to do today is compare the video quality of the Xperia 1 Mark IV to that of the Sony A1. Not just the quality, but the capabilities of this new smartphone as well. Speaking with Sony recently, the Xperia Pro I, their latest model, was a photography-focused smartphone. And they've told me the Xperia 1 Mark IV is geared towards videographers, filmmakers, and live streamers, meaning they've really upped the game in terms of what this phone is capable of in the video department. The main thing we're going to see is what I consider 4 lenses on the phone itself, and most importantly, its ability to shoot 4K 120 frames per second on all 4 lenses. Now earlier Xperia models were able to shoot 4K 120, but were limited to only having 1 lens with that ability. What Sony has done now is unlocked that ability for all 4 lenses, giving you total free range as a creator to shoot in a super smooth buttery 4K slow-mo, which is just a great option to have. The lenses on the phone itself are a 16mm f2.2, a 24mm f1.7, and then an optical zoom 85mm to 125mm f2.3 to 2.8. When I say optical zoom, I mean this camera retains its quality from 85mm all the way to 125mm, whereas other smartphones have a digital zoom, meaning it's going to lose some of that quality. Now, of course, getting out in the botanical gardens, I couldn't resist immediately testing out the 4K 120 capabilities on the Xperia smartphone. I rigged the smartphone onto our A1 using a sort of easy little system that we had, and honestly, it worked out pretty well. I was able to get similar shots with the phone and the camera at the same time, making my life easier so I didn't have to reshoot everything twice. And it actually offered some pretty good extra stabilization to the phone's footage itself, having it rigged to the A1. So that was a nice touch as well. Side by side, the immediate thing you'll notice on the Xperia shots is that there is of course a crop on that 4K 120, and the Xperia does have a different aspect ratio than the Sony A1 in 4K. That being said, the crop is something you can obviously plan around. Knowing there's a crop, you can frame your subjects differently, which was a bit tricky in our circumstance with the rig that we had set up, but I sort of determined that the rig was worth that sort of calculation. And I will say that aspect ratio does give a really nice cinematic feel to the Xperia smartphone, because if you do import the footage into a 4K sequence, it's gonna automatically give you those sort of cinematic bars without having to do any cropping at all. So that is like a nice little interesting touch that maybe wasn't necessarily planned for. The footage on the 1 Mark IV, I mean, it's spectacular. It's crazy now what these smartphones can do. I don't really know how you can step it up anymore. What's next, like 8K? You can't really make a bigger sensor size. So besides 4K 120, I don't really know what else these smartphones can do. The 4K 120 on the Xperia 4 Mark III is spectacular. Sure, there are noticeable differences between the smartphone and the Sony A1. The Sony A1's dynamic range just outweighs it a little bit, especially considering we shot midday in such a dramatic lighting setting. You're really gonna notice like that dynamic range is gonna come in hand. However, I was really impressed with the flexibility of the footage on the Xperia, especially going back in to color grade the footage. I was really surprised to see how much I could actually go in and color grade it without destroying the footage completely. So that was a really unexpected and nice touch on the Xperia phone. Another thing to notice on the Xperia is that they are fixed apertures on each lens. So the day I shot was really bright. It was midday because that's just when we have time to shoot. And getting my exposure was a challenge because I'm not able to stop down to something like f22 or put an ND filter on it. I didn't use an ND filter at all today because I didn't want to put one on the A1. I thought that would be a bit unfair comparing the two. There are ND filters on the market for smartphones now, which is definitely something I would highly recommend. That's just going to give you way more flexibility to properly expose on a day like today. What I had to do was really just up the shutter speed really high, and I was afraid that was going to cause some severe motion blur problems. However, at 120 4K, honestly, the footage is super buttery. It's really comparable to the A1 in terms of the smoothness and how stable it all is. I really loved the 4K 120 on this phone. It's just really amazing. After shooting 4K 120, I wanted to shoot in regular 4K 24 frames per second and compare the two again side by side. And as you can see, the footage on the Xperia really holds up. I was shooting Venice CS on the Xperia, which is an option they give you on the Cinematography Pro app, along with being able to have full manual control over the camera. And on my A1, I was shooting an S-Log 3. I gotta say, I probably regret a little bit shooting in the Venice CS mode because it does have a sort of desaturated look to it that on such a vibrant day with like all these flowers in place, I probably just should have shot in standard and had my own options to sort of color grade a little bit more on my own. However, even shooting that Venice CS, I did still have a lot of flexibility to make the image vibrant enough in post to my liking. Then when shooting in 24 frames per second, you'll note that you're gonna get a lot of image shake on the Xperia smartphone. One, because you're shooting handheld, if you are shooting handheld, and two, because it's such a lightweight device that you're just not gonna get that sort of stable shots you could get out of a fully rigged system on a mirrorless camera. But what Sony has done to compensate for this is add really superb in-body stabilization to the lenses on this camera. The 16mm lens on the Xperia does not have the in-body stabilization feature because shooting that wide, you'll notice that it's not actually a problem. At 16mm, you're still going to get a really smooth shot. At 24, it starts to come into play, as you can see here. But with that image stabilization on, the shots get so much smoother. It's really noticeable while you're shooting, just turning it on and off. And lastly, shooting on that 85 to 125mm lenses are where you're going to really need that in-body stabilization. Because it's such long focal lengths, you're going to get a lot of shake, especially at 125. And again, having the option to have that in-body stabilization really fixes a lot of that shake. And then shooting again in 120 at these focal lengths, added with the in-body stabilization, you get a really super smooth shot. I gotta say, I love shooting at 125 with this phone. I had the 135 Sony G Master lens compared to it, and I love the compression you get out of that lens, especially with all these cherry blossoms in the background. Having our model feel so close to camera, despite being far away with that compression in the background, is a really pleasing image. The last test we did was comparing the autofocus on both the A1 and the Xperia smartphone. I would say the A1 has probably the strongest autofocus out of any mirrorless camera on the market, so it was definitely a tall task for the Xperia 1 Mark IV to take on, but it did a stellar job. Sony just has an amazing system when it comes to their autofocus, and it really counts for this camera as well. I should also note that I was shooting probably 5 or 6 hours in the sun all day, and the battery life on the Xperia stayed to 62%. So I went from a full charge shooting all day in 4K 120 and still had 62% battery left with no charges in between. And the phone didn't overheat once. Even the A1 overheated a couple times and I had to turn it off and let it rest for a while. So just having a phone that doesn't have that problem shooting 4K 120 was a pretty spectacular thing. Now, if you're a filmmaker, a videographer, content creator, live streamer of any kind, having a phone now that has total flexibility to shoot in what I would say is an important ability to have in today's video world, that 4K 120 capabilities, even a beloved camera like the A7 III wasn't able to shoot 4K 120. So now the Xperia has even leapfrogged that mirrorless camera. And yes, obviously there's the A7 IV out, which can shoot it with a crop similar to the Xperia. Having that option in a ultimately a cheaper bundle, because consider, yes, you're getting the phone obviously and all the abilities that the Xperia has with the camera side of it, but you're getting these 4 lenses in it, which is really why I took out these 3 G Master lenses, was to compare, like, yes, you're getting the camera, but you're also getting these lenses that all perform equally well on the Xperia. So it's pretty revolutionary what they're able to do in this. I don't know where you can take this next, but I love what Sony has been doing with all these Xperia models coming out, focusing on different things for each model. This one definitely primed towards videographers, filmmakers who want even an A. I can't even call it a B camera. This can be an A camera. It's that good. So that's going to do it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed watching. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Please consider leaving a like and subscribing to Focus Camera. And thanks for watching.